Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming along to our big snapshot update webinar. We're going to be looking at new data, new reporting periods, federal electoral profiles, and other bits and pieces. We've got a lot of people on hand here today to help answer any questions, and it's great to have everybody here. I'd like to start by acknowledging First Nation people throughout the land. I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the people of the Kulin Nation, the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne, and would like to acknowledge them as traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and elders from many other communities. I'd like to acknowledge that the land that we meet on right now is a place of age-old ceremonies, celebration, initiation and renewal, and that this land was never ceded. I'd encourage you to jump in and change your Zoom handle with your name, your organisation, where you're from, and also the land that you're calling on. Hopefully you know the drill by now. There's those 2 or 3 little dots in the top right-hand corner. If not, there are quite a few other ironbarkers on the line who can help out with that, but please jump on and do so. Here is today's agenda. A bit of welcome, housekeeping, start, a little bit about you. We always, for those that are new to Ironbark webinars, have a few survey questions at the start before you attend. We appreciate you filling them out, and we actually go through and let you know who else is on the line and what everyone's thinking and the different levels, I guess, that people are at. We then get straight into the big snapshot updates, the new profiles, geographic regions, a couple of social media and image changes, profile changes. We've got about 20 minutes for that item. However, we might take questions as we go, in which case that might stretch out a little bit because we can keep it nice and informal today. We'll have a bit of a look at what's in store for Snapshot for 2022, a couple of ideas, or those that are probably most likely to go ahead. And then any other final questions, we'll be out of here by 12. We also have on the line to help out Natalie Isaac from Ironbark, Dr. Richard Ryle from Ironbark, Imogen Jubb, formerly BZE and now at Ironbark, and Matthew Sullivan Kilgore, who is in transit. He's back, so he'll be here soon. And I think Richard and Matthew might be doing a bit of a tag team, but they're the technical brains behind a lot of the stuff that can answer any of your questions. All right. This is going to be really informal, so jump in whenever you like with questions through the chat function. We can keep it structured, but it is December. It's the end of a long year, so any questions that you like, jump in. Any comments that you want, jump in. It's a nice, smallish crowd. We've got 33 participants of about 60 odd registrations, so it's going to be quite an easy and chilled session. We are recording, so others can make the most of this, and we can chuck it online to see if anyone has missed and wants to know the updates. And everyone's doing pretty well with this one at the moment, but mute yourself just in case the controls aren't working the way here as they should be. Any questions, jump into the chat function. If we don't have time to answer them today, we can follow up later, or you can always give us a buzz. Email the hello@snapshot.com.au or snapshotclimate.com.au address. If you've got any questions, please try and be as specific and clear as possible, but you can also unmute yourself if need be. And just a reminder, if you haven't already, to please, I can see there's some comments in there. Yeah, jump on, update your Zoom handle with your name, your organisation and the country you're calling from. The 2 dots there to do that within the Zoom functionality. Otherwise, if you're not sure, just ask the team, because we've got a few people here who can help. Most people are aware that Ironbark and BZE got together a couple of years ago to develop Snapshot. BZE are an independent solutions-focused think tank. We've been working with them on this amazing project for the last couple of years. Essentially, we were all looking at developing emissions profiles for councils and community groups, all doing similar sort of work, and thought this is just not great. It's not great that we're getting a situation where community groups, for example, are trying to learn about the GPC profile to develop their own emissions profile or inventory for their whole community when we had the data. So we got together with the wonderful Lord Mayor's Travel Foundation, who funded us to basically gather all of this IP between the 2 organisations, put it online and give us this wonderful tool. 537 councils, snapshots, emissions profiles, from every council area in Australia. That's there, and that's how it's been for the last couple of years. We've also, over the last few years, had a lot of other really awesome funders and partners who have jumped on board: Sustainability Victoria, DPI in New South Wales, and DES in Queensland, Legant in New South Wales, Local Government Association, who I think are here today, and Telematics Trust. And this awesome situation in South Australia where the state government wasn't in a position to fund the South Australian snapshots. And so all of these councils here got together and said, look, what about we all chuck in a few grand? We'll try and reach that amount and crowdsource to try and help get the SA councils along, which was last year. They all did that. And we've also, all of the data and all the methodologies available for review over the last few years. These organisations have been involved in reviewing, endorsing and checking the data. There's a little snapshot of Snapshot. We recently were a finalist at the Premier Sustainability Award. We were runners up to the Cape. Congratulations to the Cape, I guess. Not bitter about that at all. We might have deserved it, but no, the Cape are wonderful. Congratulations to them. It was great to get that far. A couple of other bits of work that we're all pretty flat chat busy doing a trillion things at once, but you might be interested in, because this actually combines the work of Ironbark and BZE. There's a report that was recently developed for Geelong Sustainability, essentially looking at emissions profiles, but also then looking at jobs in the region. So Geelong Sustainability and ACF Community Geelong have just released this. This is the Roadmap to Zero Emissions Geelong Region's Job Analysis, a research report that presents the breadth and depth of employment opportunities across the whole Geelong region if we were to embrace the race to net zero emissions economy. So this report was undertaken by Ironbark using data from BZE and their Million Jobs Plan, and looks at the kind of jobs that could be produced or created over the next couple of years. You can download this report from that link there, and if someone from the Ironbark team could chuck that link into the chat, that would be great. If not, we'll send it through afterwards. But the sort of potential I think that we have using the emissions data that we have and the jobs data from organisations like Beyond Zero Emissions are showing us this pretty amazing findings that with coordinated planning, more than 24,000 new jobs could be created in the next 5 years in various sectors, from building retrofits, renewable energy generation, manufacturing, electric transport, created throughout Geelong, Queenscliff, Golden Plains, Surf Coast and Colac, Otway Shire. Go and have a look at it. The methodology is all there. If you're interested in similar sort of work for your area or council, get in touch with us. A couple of years ago, we had a webinar. It was called Councils and Climate Action, CCR, COM, CDP, CTP, CPP, WTF, because the amount of acronyms in this world was driving everybody crazy. Just to let you all know that there is an updated version of that if you would like to download it. Again, if we can get the link in the chat, otherwise we'll send it through. But just a bit of recent work that you might be interested in downloading and checking out the trillions of things that are going on at the moment. All right, here's who's here. Welcome everybody. Lovely to see an amazing breadth of organisations from around the country. We've got a nice mix, kind of looks a little bit like the Australian population split. I asked you a couple of questions as well at the start. So one of the ones was whether you currently report or you disclose your council emissions through global reporting platforms. The majority of people have said, nope. We had quite a few that said they would do it if you could click a button on Snapshot, for example, that just says report, and a lot who aren't aware of what CDP is. We talked about reporting through CDP, which is sort of the global platform for reporting emissions. We want and we expect nation states, businesses to report their emissions. Likewise, they and the global frameworks expect, so they should, local governments to do exactly the same thing. And we want to make sure that there's transparency and disclosure to try and perhaps look at whether it can be done automatically through Snapshot. Interestingly, when we move the data around here from this question and we just ask local government responses and attendees today, there are a lot more that have said, yes, we would do it through Snapshot, and a high proportion that do currently report through CDP, because it's a bit of a sort of technical process. This was fantastic. This is exactly what we wanted to see. And here we asked whether people are sharing their snapshot profiles with other stakeholders. Most people now are. We would highly recommend people keep doing this, and also including snapshot profiles in reports or presentations, because we always saw it as potentially a fantastic communications device compared to the grainy old Excel graphs that we would have in the old days. This is now there for everybody to explain exactly where your emissions are coming from in a nice, clear and consistent way across the country. And a really quick hats off to Renew Gold Coast, who had this event we just saw a couple of weeks ago, to basically say, let's have a look where our emissions are coming from. And what we find from that is that we're getting more of a focus on those areas that we as a society, as a community, really need to focus on, those big pieces of the pie or the donut, and perhaps not looking as much at those where it's smaller or business as usual is already helping getting emissions down. And most people have used Snapshot to set targets and inform strategies. So it is there, the data's there, there's so much information on the FAQ page and the resources page. So please continue to do that and jump in and let us know how it's working for you, because we will frame the changes according to what we hear from the local government sector and community groups. And so that is you. For example, this is a bit of a harder graph to read, but we asked about the key improvements or updates we'd like to see in Snapshot. Probably no surprises here. The key things that we are hearing from people are improved data accuracy, granularity, the ability to maybe, get in a little bit deeper into what you mean by industrial emissions, climate action planning, targets, jobs and economic data. We've just seen a little case study how that can happen. Collaboration, emissions forecasting were the key things that came out. And when later on I go and quickly touch on a bit of a sneak peek of what we're looking to do in 2022, some of these things we're hoping to include, but this really helps us to inform the directions. And as most people will know, when you're looking at funding applications or speaking to potential funders, if you're able to say, we had a survey or we had a webinar and this is what people want, it really helps us put this information forward and look at potentially including it in future updates to Snapshot. Okay, everyone needs to quickly read this slide. No, don't worry about reading this slide, but these are the questions that have come through, and we will answer them throughout. And when we send through the slide deck, you can again get a feel for the sort of things that people were after. And finally, about you, the comments or the testimonials that again really help us when we are trying to get resourcing and funding for future improvements. And we love hearing this because there's a lot of work, a lot of resourcing from states, philanthropic, a lot of volunteer work that's gone into this tool over the last couple of years. So to hear that it's helping getting the message out there, an effective communication tool, to hear that communities use this to successfully advocate councils to set ambitious targets is what it's about. And this is the kind of action that we love to see a couple of years later. So for those that gave us some testimonials without naming names, Murrumbidgee, Renew, Glen Ira, Zero SE, FNQ, Moonee Valley, Southeast Climate Action, Pyrenees and Zero SE, we really appreciate it. All right, we're now going to move into the big updates, and I'm going to see if I can jump back into the chat function to see if there are any questions specifically around these things, which there aren't. Look, the first thing is if you jump on now, you've got a new year. We've now got the July 2019 to June 2020 financial year. Whenever we have the ability to put new data and new information up there, we will. And you can now go and see how you're tracking and what the latest year says. As you'll know from previous Snapshot webinars, we need to be a little bit careful about not using Snapshot as a monitoring tool, not to see that emissions might be going down because of something that we're doing. At the same time, I don't know if we can see it yet, but certainly for the next one, June 2020 was kind of when that big global pandemic was starting to bite. And we are actually going to, for the first time, be able to see in the next year or two, the impacts of one event or one or two big things that are happening on the emissions profiles. What we've seen with recent Google data is this happens specifically looking at transport, where emissions in certain areas go down significantly. But we can start to look at some broad trends with these latest years. So jump on 1920, it's there. You can now see what your emissions profiles are for the most recent year. As soon as we have the ability to get new data up there, we will put it up. We also have federal electorates and state emissions profiles. So quite interesting with an election just around the corner in, what are we thinking, March or May next year. But just like snapshot profiles for municipal areas can be used to talk to councils and to engage and look at areas where we need to start reducing emissions. Likewise, if you know people that are involved in Voices for Goldstein or Indi, should I say, or key electorate areas, we can now start understanding what the emissions are throughout federal electorates. Appreciate the funding from the Telematics Trust that gave us this. I actually have a question or two here, which is great. I'm going to jump to them now as they come in. Lorraine has asked, will the new profiles show bushfire burning off pollution? And I'm going to ask Richard whether you're able to answer that one, please.
So it might be a good one for Matt, actually, because I think I saw him come online.
Oh, he's here. Matt, welcome. How are you feeling?
I've felt better, but I've also felt worse. Yeah, so just answering that question. So the bushfire data is not currently put into Snapshot. Sort of a snapshot, it's like an adjacent emission sources to the more conventional sources. So because bushfires, so the main source of emissions from that, which is essentially the combustion of trees to produce carbon, that is certainly a source that could be included. We're not including it currently in the methodology. We would need to track down and create a source for that to do the allocation. But the reason it's not currently being included is because it's not technically a land use change. So because if it was the case that an area of forest burnt down and then was replaced with something that was not forest, so they took advantage of the forest burning down and they said, okay, well, let's just make this farmland now, then that would certainly constitute the land use change. That's obviously not to say that the carbon emissions aren't occurring, and certainly in our timescale now, where we're sort of measuring things in years, that sort of emissions of carbon is problematic, but it also has a reasonably rapid return to equilibrium as well. So forest regrowth, say, has a 20-year period where a large chunk of that carbon emitted is returned to the carbon store of the forest. So short answer is not currently.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt, and great to see you back on deck. Matt's calling in from Tassie. We're scattered all over the place, and so it's not COVID related yet, we don't think, but glad that you're here. And while you're unmuted, might just actually push this next question to you as well from Dorothy, and jump in too, Matt, if you can see it. But how are we correctly accounting for the methane, black carbon, carbon monoxide, and ideal CO2 emissions from wood heaters? In my LGA over the next 20 years, global warming from wood heaters will be 2 to 10 times greater than all residential emissions. Give us a shout out, Dorothy, to let us know where you're calling from too. You might have done it earlier, but maybe just jump in there as well. It's really important to know this, otherwise we won't be able to find the best ways to reduce contribution.
Yes, thank you very much for raising that question. So we did take a close look at what those numbers were. So the main emission sources for the wood-fired heaters, because there's a couple of answers to this question. So we're talking about the embedded CO2 so the embedded carbon, which is converted into CO2 as a result of combusting the wood. And the second part is an imperfect combustion leading to the presence of higher than 1 GWP gases being emitted. For the CO2 itself, that's there are different approaches that can be taken here. We're taking the approach which is that essentially constitutes a carbon neutral exchange. So If it's the case that it's taken from forest that is then not replanted, then that is recorded, but it's recorded as a land use change. If it's taken from forest that is replanted, then it's considered to be neutral from a wood extraction, and that's the embedded embedded carbon converted into CO2 in the tree. The other two key factors there are the emissions of carbon monoxide, CO, and of carbon black, which both have higher than 1 GWP factors. So we went through, and we are interested, but we're not currently recording those figures. We are interested in bringing them to the table. They're quite minor contributors to the overall emissions for Australia, but as you've highlighted, they start to become more substantive in relation to residential emissions specifically, particularly as residential emissions from stationary energy drops as the grid greens. So we will be exploring bringing them in for future reporting. Just as a general observation, CO and CB, carbon monoxide, carbon black, are not currently reported to the IPCC framework, which is not a barrier, but it's just a consideration we're thinking about compatibility with, say, the national framework.
No worries. Matt, did you want to add a final quick comment to those other points there? We can come back to them because it could be a bit of a rabbit hole. So I've noted them here, but just whether there's a quick response. Carbon neutrality of biomass is roundly regarded as false accounting. Regrowth of biomass trees does not meet our climate emergency timescale.
Okay, sure. Well, so that's definitely factors that we could consider. So the timescale is like a really important one. You know, are we going for a 20, 50, 100-year time frame? We'd be very happy to have this conversation and talk to what are the factors that would consider the appropriate timeframes to consider, and we may sort of present that as an option for Snapshot to say to report to those different windows. So yeah, very happy to look into that further. Yeah, I realize like some of the maths gets a bit like we're not trying to introduce false accounting, but yeah, some of the maths does warrant closer investigation for some of these numbers. And methane is, of course, is that in response to the question?
I'm not sure. We might come back to it then. We said it might get a bit technical today. We've got the technical people online. So Dorothy and Arabella especially, I've just made a note to come back to this at the end when we have the bigger Q&A session, and maybe we'll unmute you as well. And if we don't get to it, because it is
methane certainly is on IPCC, but we didn't see large methane factors from wood heater combustion. Like it existed, but it's very minor as a part of their emissions profile. The majority being CO, CO2 and CB. So, but happy we can. Yes, again, short answer is no. That's not currently being accommodated in Snapshot, but we will be really happy to look at working groups to. Methane is significant in wood heating. Oh, sorry, the numbers that were supplied to us didn't suggest that to be the case. So I will, I'll reinvestigate that.
Beautiful. There's a lot there. So yeah, let's. So Laura, firstly, we're going to come to waste in a second, and so we can see what your question is specifically there. As far as the broader questions around domestic wood heaters and that issue, we'll come back to it at the end because it is specific to certain regions. And if we don't get today, as Matt says, we're setting up working groups for Snapshot, so we can look at certain areas, whether it can be included within or in different adjacent tools, then we can look at all of these sort of things. Another change, you can jump on and click on your Snapshot profile and share it through social media. And there also is the ability to now, I think we're just waiting on a few buttons to be fixed. So just give us a few days grace with this, with the ability to download like better quality images as opposed to just screenshots of snapshots to include in any presentation material that you might have or might want. Now, anyone that's been to a Snapshot webinar before would have seen these slides because data's going to change. It improves. And we've always faced with this question of what we do with this resource sitting online when we get updated, more accurate and better data. And what we've done now And a big change is that we've got additional data and methodology updates that have been applied to previous snapshot profiles. So it means that your snapshot profile for, I think, 1920 might have changed, primarily due to updated stationary energy consumption data for 2019-20, updated emissions coefficients, and updated methodology for stationary energy residential sector to ensure that they add up to the state totals for each year's. And we'll go through an example of how and where this would have happened. And I guess we, again, from a workshop or a webinar that we held in September last year, we had a poll and we asked everybody, like, what do we do if we suddenly find that there's this holy grail of distribution businesses that say they're going to send us every bit of data, and what's more, it's more granular, it's accurate, it's compliant, and it's complete. As most people know, we need to actually make sure that the data we have is compliant with the Global Protocol for Community Scale Emissions, or GPC. And when we asked everybody at this webinar last year, it was pretty clear that everybody just said, yep, put it in. And then we try and communicate it and make sure we're clear when we have these changes. And so that's what we're doing. If we can source more accurate or more complete or compliant data, we're going to do it. And we're going to have events like this to explain how and what's going on. So here's an example. If you are in the wonderful municipality of Darebin, then your profile last week for 2019 looked like this, 1.759 million tonnes. And it now looks like this, 1.652 million tonnes. So this change is not because of any council action or interaction, but what we're seeing is a reduced total municipal emissions. So it's gone down a bit, a slight decreased proportion of emissions from electricity in this case, a reduced contribution from the industrial sector, and slight changes to waste, transport, and gas proportions. And so for many or most profiles for the 2019 year, you're likely to see a change. And this is why. Matt and Richard, again, jump in here if you like, and then I do have some questions that we've come in from advance in advance of the session. But we're using state consumption figures for each year. So previously we had modelled, this is for residential, commercial and industrial electricity emissions. Previously we'd modelled consumption data for 2017 based on state figures, and then we used population figures to adjust for different years. So maybe we don't actually have the data from each individual house or site. And so this has an impact on all electricity and gas figures, and electricity scope coefficients were updated for 2018, 2019. So these are used to calculate emissions that are updated annually by the National Greenhouse Account Factors published by the federal government. We always use the most up-to-date and accurate coefficients, but there's a bit of a lag between the updates, and so sometimes we're making changes retrospectively. So electricity scope coefficients were altered due to historic update, and that has a flow-through effect on all of the profiles.
Can I just add something there quickly, Lex?
Please.
And so, yeah, just with, so that's predominantly for like the residential sector. So like the 2017 numbers and then scaling for population growth. So consumption's actually been somewhat stable over the years, but actually population's increasing. And so per capita consumption's actually sort of coming down. So that's why we'll see a bit of a reduction. But one of the main reasons why there's changes for 2019 is we've updated the consumption data for stationary energy for all sectors, so commercial, industrial, and residential. So moving forward, what we're going to do is, so we're not updating for 2020 this year, because if we were, we would have to use projected numbers for stationary energy, and then we would end up in a similar problem or circumstance in 12 months time where we're updating those numbers again. And so that's what we're trying to avoid. So that's why now we're just updating 2019-20, because that's the most recent data we have for stationary energy. So we've actually got Google transport data for 2020, but yeah, we don't have that for the other sources and sectors. So unfortunately, yeah, we can't update the profiles for 2020 just yet.
Awesome. Thanks, Rich. Got a question that came in advance. I live in Latrobe City Council. I have trouble understanding the data due to large emissions from brown coal generations at 3 large power plants. Its major emission source is electricity consumption, with the majority of this coming from industrial consumption. Can you provide clarification regarding industry emissions? Matt or Richard?
Yeah, I can clarify.
Thank you.
All right. So there are, so for emissions that are directly result from the point of generation through to the supply for electricity, for distribution electricity network, those emissions are grouped into the scope 2 emissions buckets. And so they are distributed to any user that is using those emissions. There is a bunch of ancillary processes and just the presence of industry and industry adjacent aspects of some aspects of generation that fall into the general industry classification of the energy services. And in those instances, we have done some apportionment of that to those locations. So it just sort of reflects the fact that there is a lot of ancillary industrial activity taking place. So what we do have, so the things that we know is that we're not introducing double counting. So that means that it's not that the emissions are associated with this, with the generation of this power are then are allocated to Latrobe and then subsequently also being allocated to electricity users elsewhere in the state. We could definitely look to explore if that allocation is entirely appropriate. So because the classification of how emissions are allocated to scope 3 or to scope 1 in instances of electricity generation sites, that forms a little bit of an arbitrary delineation as to like which is included and which isn't. And so we've developed methodologies that are compliant with international standards, but also we do want them to reflect the local sort of capacities and ability to take action. So that means there is an opportunity to refine that. And in general, I would say that this is one of the weaker places of Snapshot is how it deals with very, very large macro generation sites in general, or macro emitting sites in general. So that's sort of like the distinction I would make there. But we can, these are the sort of conversations I think are quite interesting worth having. So to explore if maybe that the line is falling a little bit on one side or another in regards to like how the allocation is being done locally or to the generalized grid.
Lex, sorry, you're on mute.
Rookie error. Moving on to gas. Electricity and gas consumption for each state has been updated for 1920. Rich, feel free to jump in here. Gas leakage coefficients have been updated, but I understand that's not a major impact on things. Is that right, Rich?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Great. If I'm getting no questions about gas, then I'm going to move on to transport. Google Transport data updated for 2020. They'll only impact on the 1920 profiles, as was mentioned before. Registered motor vehicles by vehicle type for each local government area was updated for 1920. So that impacts on snapshot profiles for 18, 19, and 2019. A couple of updates. Google Transport data was previously using emissions coefficients for pre-2004 vehicles, which has been updated, resulting in like a minor change to nitrous oxide emissions, again, all the way into the back end Excel spreadsheets that feed up to Snapshot. Impacts a little bit on Google Transport data for 18 and 19. And Google Transport data was previously used for all the major cities, but was using greater metropolitan data rather than the municipality itself, which it now is. There were no questions around transport in the survey, so I might move on as well. I'm noticing there's a few comments again around gas and other bits and pieces, which we'll come back to, which is great. And finally, though, for waste, minor changes may occur due to the rounding of snapshot numbers to the nearest 1,000 when it comes to waste. Laura from Murrindindi, did you have a question about methane and waste? If you wanted to unmute yourself and jump in or write it down there.
Hi.
Hey,
No, that was my question was about agriculture, so I'll wait until we
Oh.
get to that. All good.
hello, agriculture. Using statistical level area for regions for the 2019-20 was updated, which will impact on snapshot profiles for 19. Land use data for Vic, Queensland, Tassie has been updated to correct an issue with naming conventions, which was resulting in land use amounts being displayed as 0 for some LGAs within those states, caused by an inconsistency in state names in different tables. As simple as that. I've got a few questions here around ag, but maybe we'll start with you then, Laura.
Yeah, I was just wondering how, over what time period is the methane compared with the carbon dioxide? Because I understand whether it's, you know, over a 100-year time period or like a 20 or a 10-year time period, you get quite a different result.
Rich, Matt?
Yeah, we're using the 50-year time interval, but we're considering moving to 20. So moving to the 20, just for everyone's benefit, the main impact of moving from, say, a 50 to a 20 is that methane increases fairly substantially in impact. Meanwhile, nitrous gases actually decrease in impact. So there's a bit of an up and down, but methane, particularly for agriculture, is the more significant contributor, and so it would lead to an increase in emissions estimates.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. Here's a question. Can any assumptions around agriculture and the types of agriculture counted be provided in Snapshot as subtotals like other sectors? It's probably less clear when communicating with agriculture industry-based councils, as many councils are primary producers themselves and very invested in the data presented. As these have been the more intensive emission sectors I've been presenting, someone from a rural council, I expect there are further questions on how we can get into a little bit more detail. So without this detail, the types of agriculture, it's hard to have the conversation about emission reduction actions. Is that possible? Is that down the track an option, Matt, Richard?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if you're going to show that image I sent earlier, but yeah, we've actually got a lot of that data currently. So we've got breakdowns by subsectors for agriculture in terms of like pigs, meat cattle, dairy cattle, and so on and so forth, and then also by emissions type. But yeah, I guess we're sort of exploring different ways to, you know, communicate things with council, because some councils obviously, you know, just want a very broad overview, whereas other councils might want, you know, as much information or detail as possible. So yeah, we sort of have some of this more granular data currently, but yeah, we're still exploring different options or ways to discuss this with council.
Perfect. Thanks, Rich. Another question, have factors for forest and soil carbon been changed in light of the huge amount of research that's gone on in this space since 2006? If that's not specific enough, we can move on and ask the person to give us more information.
Yeah, it would be amazing to be directed towards a place where you think that would be appropriate to consider for that research. So we certainly source more recent data sets than 2006. So you might be referring to the 2006 IPCC guidelines. So they've got the 2006 release date. That may or may be what you're considering, but if it is, then those guidelines themselves have been updated a number of times. And so I think the latest update is 2019. So they don't necessarily do a complete update though. So they may be, I would have to confirm with them as to if that factor, if the wood factors have taken into account the research that you're referring. We also do draw from a few other sources. So we've got some information coming out of studies from South Australia and some studies from New South Wales and Queensland. But if you do have information, I personally am not like satisfied with where the factors are. I find that there is, it's one of the areas where I guess confidence due to like you know, the differing elements of, say, the vegetation type, geospatial region, climatic region, these kind of elements are they introduce complexities for how to do determinations of these factors at the scale we're talking about. So I'm very interested in finding further data to support that. That would be terrific if it's possible.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And someone else had also made a comment about the vast majority of agricultural and land use changes attributed to animal agriculture. Really useful to see these grouped together as a category on Snapshot to help guide and communicate action. So, for example, cropping emissions versus animal emissions. Rich, I think perhaps that's a bit related to your point in the earlier question, that yes, that is the sort of thing that we are looking at doing and we can do. It's more about how we bring that data into the functionality of a tool that's there for everyone. Methodology is still available, always will be, and as soon as we have any updates, it's now a 90-odd page document. You can check to see if your airport is included, whether we have updated for certain things. It's all publicly available and transparent. There's a bit of info at the start too on the basic things around scopes and what happens with power stations and how those emissions are attributed as well. Before we move on to the getting back to some other questions and even opening it up further, just to let you know, this is the table that Rich was referring to before. So we've been working behind the scenes looking at compiling more data and more granular data, which would allow councils and communities to dig further into, the different areas via the Snapshot platform. So instead of just looking at, even your total industrial emissions, you can actually go down and have a look at ag, forestry, mining, manufacturing, construction, wholesale trade, retail trade, etc., whatever it might be, which can then provide greater insights that can assist in climate action planning. It's something that has come through in today's survey. It came through loud and clear in the local government review survey earlier this year. And it would mean that potentially we could do something that looks a little bit more like this, but we always want to make sure that the data that we have is not going to be misleading or doesn't sort of have the veneer of being more accurate than it is. And so we make sure that there's a fairly vigorous review process before we put this up there, and it needs to be available for all councils. But certainly, pending some potential funding, this is the sort of thing that we could be doing next year, quite early next year. The other thing is we're looking at cohorts, so the ability to maybe get in there and look at comparing and contrasting with similar types of councils. Often councils share information, looking at regional areas, alliances, rocks, whatever it might be, or someone that we think is leading or similar. But what we've got at the background is data that actually looks at what we call a cohort, checking out things like your total emissions, population, gross regional product, CFA or socioeconomic indexes for areas ratings. And so you're actually getting a data-driven comparison to who is a similar council to yours. And what we're, again, hoping to do, this is not locked in, but a bit of a sneak peek of the sort of things we're looking at for 2022, is the ability to do these sort of comparisons within Snapshot. So you can get a bit more of a sense of the character, whether you're a higher emitter or lower emitter or something in between, opening up opportunities, probably most importantly for learning and collaboration between other municipalities which share similar characteristics. Watch this space. And finally, reporting. So again, I talked about the concept of reporting at the start and why it's considered important for a lot of the global programs. We're hoping to be able to have a bit of a ability for councils to log in either at this CDP, the global reporting platform, or Snapshot, so you're able to actually, without any frustration or annoyance or burdensome process, report. When people hear about reporting, they go, that sounds horrible. But if it was to be an easier thing to do, and we've found in the past that councils are pretty keen on actually doing this, if it was easy, then they would. So fingers crossed we could look at some sort of one-click automated data transfer for councillors that are interested. All right, I'm actually going to just jump straight into Q&A now. So over to everybody, really. Here are the questions that came earlier. Again, you don't have to read those, but I've got them here, which I will start pushing over to the team. But before we do, just for those that are actually online, Dorothy and Arabella, did you guys want to talk a bit about the questions that you had? You mentioned there's a fair bit of bottled gas use in Armidale region, but it's not included in Snapshot. Matt and Richard, I can pass to you guys first with that. We've got 13, 14 odd minutes to go, so we'll keep the answers succinct, and if it goes over time, we might take them up later. Please, Sharon. But that first one there, my understanding is that bottled gas is not really of the scale that we need to be focusing on to get to net zero by 2030, but I could be wrong. Matt, Richard?
Yeah, so the bottle gas discussion is hits upon 2 points, which is one of the main points where we do see issues with the way Snapshot reports. So bottle gas overall as an element of emissions for Australia is a relatively low emission source. And that does not mean necessarily that for a specific municipality that's the case, but as for overall, which means that generally we've been sort of working through the solutions, starting with the highest emission sources and working down. The second part of one of the reasons why it's a little bit tricky to look at bottled gas is because there is, to our efforts thus far, not a consistent data set that records the geospatial location of bottled gas use. And so we are looking at solutions around that. There is survey data available around bottled gas use. One of the issues we have with the survey data is that it doesn't do particularly good geospatial distributions. And so we're worried about the way that that might represent gas use in certain areas. It's certainly an area we're quite interested in exploring though. So if it's possible, if we do come up with consistent and reliable ways of doing that determination of allocating to specific municipalities or other localities, we'd be really keen to pursue.
Thanks, Matt. Another great question that we've had discussions about a lot here, is it worth considering how to account for the renewable energy in a particular area? How can we create a positive version of Snapshot showing all the solutions in a given region? There's a whole webinar's worth, there's a whole days of workshops worth of discussion here, but maybe just a quick comment from anyone in the room, and Dorothy and Arabella or Imogen, if you wanted to jump in as well.
Okay. Yeah, that's something I'm really keen on figuring out how to do, because Snapshot will always be the problem, even if, you know, it'll always be 100% emissions. And so what we really want to show is all the solutions of a region, so that you can see the solutions and how people are solving it in all the different sectors. So you can see, you know, what are the agricultural solutions and how do they add up, and what are the stationary energy solutions in residential, commercial and industrial subsections, and how do they add up, so people can see the part that they're playing in actually solving the problem. So that data is partially available. What we really need to do is pull it together in the most effective format. I don't think there's any sort of global protocol for that yet that exists. So there's a bit of work in tweaking out how to pull that together in the most effective and robust way. But yeah, really keen to see that as a product that we would like to work on.
As a add to that, is that okay? Yep. So as addition to that, so we could see there's really two main ways in which renewable energy generation manifests as a solution. So there's one, it's effectively energy efficiency, and that it reduces electricity consumption on site, so through embedded generation, so rooftop or the likes. And the second is where it's greening the grid, so it's making the average kilowatt hour of energy available in the grid greener. So in the first instance, we do reflect the impact of that renewable energy currently only in the residential sector. So that's we do take into account the installation rates and size of installations capacities in the residential sector for their it's one of the factors for doing a determination of energy use in the residential sector. But for exports, and so for grid supplied energy, it's not currently reflected. And so the only way that it's manifested is by modifications to the emissions coefficient for scope 2 consumption, electricity consumption. That means that it's essentially generalized, so it's applied to the state overall. We are really interested in bringing in something that I've been calling an energy balance layer, which reflects what the impact of the local generation, be it renewable or otherwise, and how that adjusts or modifies the emissions inventory for that municipality. So if you put in if you're a small rural council and you put in a giant 500 megawatt solar farm or something, that might make your council negative from a carbon emissions perspective. It is needed to be talked about separately, because otherwise you do risk introducing double counting effects and things like that. But being able to reflect that and show that effect and sort of youth promote it and talk about it as a good thing is very desirable.
Yeah, agreed. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Imogen. And it is something that is on the agenda frequently. Someone is asking, the sources for all data be provided as a downloadable function, just a high level, e.g. from this or that department. I'm assuming the methodology is as far as we can get with that. I don't know, Richard, do you feel like having some easy downloadable dynamic thing for the sources, or is the methodology document still the way to go?
All that stuff is definitely possible. I guess it's all a question of, you don't want to have too much information on the Snapshot website, because then you're sort of bombarding people. But I guess, we have the Snapshot methodology, which should definitely be able to, which should detail all the sources of data within that. But we're certainly happy to explore having a more high level sort of overview of data sources, if that's something that people are keen to have.
Thank you very much, Richard. Someone's asked, do you envisage sharing the use made of your data by other organisations? I'd be most interested to know what worked well. Imogen, Nat, anyone want to jump in there? I'm going to type the question in here.
So like metrics of use and the likes, we're really, really interested in getting better at that. That's one of our goals for this year, is to try to increase sort of standardized ways of recording that and sharing information about it. We are hoping to bring online a few more ways of talking about this and creating interactions. So, but if you've got ideas or things you're interested in doing, please get in touch.
Dorothy's question, are you going to explore realistic factors for fugitive emissions from gas fracking and coal mining?
So that's actually a conversation that we're having right now with one council in Victoria, where we're looking to provide a solution that does updated data sets for emissions coefficients developed through Renew, their work. So that has a really substantive impact on gas. I definitely suspect that that is probably a more realistic picture of the impacts of gas emissions. If you are aware of the history of how the gas emissions coefficients were developed, I think you would be suspicious of what those numbers look like. We are not currently doing that in the published figures because of a desire to stay consistent with what's being reported internationally. But we're currently exploring ways to bring those sort of avenues of revised factors in general to be used.
Awesome. I'm going to put this question in the box. Imogen, you might want to jump on for this one. How federal party policies affect what local councils do? Most of us know a bit about the effects of state government policies, but not so much the feds. If Labor were to form government, what effect would their policies have for renewable energy and community batteries have, for example?
Just trying to unmute. So they're a bit disparate at the moment, I would say, the local government and federal government policies. There's probably a fair bit of work to do to align those. There's probably a much closer relationship between state government and local government. But certainly there are policies at the federal level that would make a big difference to local government. And I think advocating for those policies is one of the tasks, both for communities and for councils. And I think providing the emissions profile at the federal level, when you can go to your MP and say, this is your emissions profile that you are directly responsible for, what will you do about it, and how can we help support you to do those things, and here are the bottlenecks at our end, and how can you help unpack them for us? I think it helps them feel responsibility for it in a way that they won't feel responsible for a local government profile, for example. So by saying, if you go to your local member and say, this is your patch, what policies are you going to work on? And we're here to help support you in developing those policies. I think that's a good first step in this approach. But yeah, there's a long way to go. And certainly some of Labor's policies around renewable energy and community batteries will help, but I would say they're still on the in the noise of the actual emissions that need to be reduced overall.
Thanks, Imogen. And to, I guess, even the questioner, to give you an example of what could happen, if there was a particular party, for example, that said, we are going to jump in and intervene in the market, not naming names, federal coalition, and try and keep Liddell going for a long time, then that's going to impact on the broader emissions factors as well. So you will see that in the coefficients that will filter through and mean that you have less renewable energy generation, and so you have higher profiles essentially. So there certainly is an impact, but yeah, it's hard to sort of have a proper understanding about where it is, but anything that's happening at those levels certainly filters through. Paula, we might take that one offline because it's just about a specific council, unless someone can jump in there and find the an answer immediately. You've got 2 minutes if you did, Matt or Richard, want to do that. There's a question about specifically Melville's profile. What I will though do is put another final question or two in this box here that came beforehand, whether it's possible to have other metrics about councils. So information on the councils. At the moment, we've got some basic info there, population, and I think climate zone, but it'd be good to have regional areas where geography, business, climate are not reflective of the average. My understanding is that is completely possible and quite straightforward, but then I guess it comes down to whether that's something that's useful for everybody. Again, Imogen, Rich, Matt, jump in if you have any thoughts there. You're on off mute, Imogen, so do you want to answer that one?
I actually think Matt's better on that one, but yeah, I think we can certainly talk more about that and talk more about cohorts as well, and how to compare between different councils so that you can see what actions are most effective for your particular patch. There's certainly there's sort of 3 broad types of councils, like the urban, the regional, and the remote, and they probably need different responses to attacking this problem. And so pooling those different types of councils together to work collaboratively or find the solutions that work, or advocate for those solutions at the state and federal government level is something to work on as well.
Matt, did you want to add a final comment there? Got a minute to go.
Sorry, I was just going to comment in relation to the Melville issue. Melville is actually one of the councils that was requested by council to use their own figures, and in those instances we do a bypass from the snapshot calculation tool, and so we're actually using figures sourced from Melville. So we can, if you would like to have a conversation about it, we can transition to the snapshot figures. We can present what those figures are before doing the update, so that you can see what they are and see if they meet your expectations. But if you do want to do that, it means you will receive the update along with everyone else. So yeah, maybe we'll have a conversation about that to see if that is in line with you. Also, if you are considering that the figures represented in Snapshot, or those supplied by you, are incorrect, as in there was a typo or something, then also please speak to us.
So Paula, you'll need to email hello@snapshotclimate.com.au about that one. So council has therefore requested that we've got our own profile, we've got our own consultants, we do it ourselves when we put it up. That's what we've done, but we can absolutely have that chat. All right, we're going to wrap it up there because we've hit 30 seconds to 12, Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time anyway. Any questions, please email them through to us anytime. We get a lot of questions at that email address, and you can always do that. There's 2 or 3 that we've missed, we didn't get to today because we had a lot in advance. That was great. Really appreciate everyone coming along. Thank you to the Snapshot team behind the scenes who've been working their backsides off in the last 7 or 8 days to get all of these things ready. But it's really gratifying to see the changes and the improvements over the last couple of years. We're still doing these things, and there's a lot of potential to move on 2022 and beyond to include all of these things that we've been talking about today. Yeah, keep the ideas coming, keep the questions coming. Thanks especially to Matt, Natalie, Richard, Imogen. I'm really sorry if I've missed any of the Ironbark or the BZE crew behind the scenes. Tom and Leah aren't here today, but also working their backsides off. Have an awesome Christmas, New Year's. Here's to a great 2022, and we'll see you in the new year.